welcome all of you here today to join us. Move LA is happy to host this Zoomposium. It's the first time we've done this. We've done a number of conferences. Many of you have been to our conference. This is the first time we've ever had several hundreds of people on a what we call a Zoomposium. At the beginning, I'd like to thank members of the Move LA team, Gloria Oland and Eli Littman and Marissa Garcia. We've been working together for several years. I think developing a pretty good track record of success. And we want to get into some new issues today with all of you out here. And we've convened an enormous, I don't really mean to say enormous, but a significant panel of leadership from around the region that are really experts. Everybody's got like an executive director, executive officer title before them. We're going to talk about what we call Boulevards of Equity and Opportunity, formerly known as Grand Boulevards. Some of you might know that from some of our email blasts in the past. But first, I want to thank some of our sponsors. I want to thank, first of all, Community Partners, who is our fiscal sponsor and has really maintained us as a healthy organization over these 12 years or so, I think now. And then also, especially the Durfee Foundation. I got initially into investigating boulevards of opportunity and equity through a grant, a Stanton Fellowship from the Durfee Foundation. And it was a tremendous learning experience. Those of you who are really looking to develop a leadership agenda, check out the Durfee Foundation and their Stanton Fellowship. I traveled to Bogota, Barcelona, Paris, Seattle, kinds of places looking at bus rapid transit. Also, of course, want to thank LA Metro for its really stellar leadership in transportation and transit development, and for participating here today. And then the Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG. A special thanks to the Urban Footprint team. You'll be seeing more from them pretty soon. Near Calthorpe, father of TOD for his work in Portland, and author of The Next American Metropolis, and Joe DiStefano, who is a founder with leader of Urban Footprint. See a lot of their work here today. I also want to thank and call out Cecilia Estolano, who's going to be a busy co-host with me today. Cecilia is a CEO of Estolano Advisors and formerly the executive director of the LA City Community Redevelopment Agency. Now, the setup for this discussion, encapsulated by the title Boulevards of Equity, or even the shift from Grand Boulevards, the original title, to Boulevards of Equity and Opportunity, reflects really a shift in thinking and emphasis and priorities. Now we must infuse our discussion properly with concerns of equity and racial justice, and all that we discuss in our urban policymaking. On your screen, you'll see really the titles, names and titles of all the participants. I will introduce them a little bit more in detail as we begin the discussion and we go from one to the other. But there they are up on the screen. You think about the last 12, 15 years, it really seems as if Los Angeles and communities all around America really have been experiencing a series of crises. We first got engaged with the traffic congestion crises in around 2006. That led to Measure R&M and an opportunity to really transform LA County's transportation system. Really, no sooner had Measure M been successful, and we began to realize that we were having a growing and worsening crisis of affordable housing and homelessness. And along with that, I think related, a crisis in transit ridership. Learning then, especially after the new president in 2016, Concerns about social equity also became increasingly paramount. And more recently, racial injustices became stark and immediate with the murder of George Floyd, the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement, all of which has been overlaid with the COVID crisis and not very far in the background, the climate change crisis. So we really are, I think, dealing with a lot, not just us in Los Angeles. In fact, I think we may be in a position to offer some real leadership model building, and that's part of what we're here to discuss today. Excuse me if I take a drink of water from time to time. So the setup here is that right after our successes with Measure R and Measure M and this affordable housing and homelessness crisis began to force itself to the front of the community's agenda, there had been discussions in Sacramento, legislatively driven discussions about what might solutions be. And the discussion was dominated by legislation that would want to increase densities in residential areas, multifamily residential areas and R1 areas near transit. And that prompted a lot of resistance. People, I think, rightly concerned about displacement and gentrification in their communities, others concerned about just disruption in their communities. We were concerned about how it all would have an effect upon voters' response to transit, because a lot of it was being formulated as a transit-driven agenda. We thought those concerns were really, I think, legitimate concerns, and we had to, we began thinking about what would be our formulation of a strategy to address the housing crisis without displacement, without gentrification, without the kind of neighborhood disruption that's been a worry in that legislation. And that led us to what we now call a proposal for boulevards of equity and opportunity. And I'll get into that a little bit more. And we want to bring Phil Washington here to help set this discussion up first, giving us a strong sense of where our transit system is, to give a large, I think broad brush description. We think that there are opportunities to build lots of housing, lots of affordable housing, even closer to transit than the legislation has, previous legislation suggested, if we only make use of increasingly available land on our commercial boulevards, most of which does not have housing or even neighborhoods on it, most of which has been commercial and needs to be making a transition because those commercial uses may be an anachronism in the future economy. That's what we're going to talk about, but we want to get Phil. Hey, Phil.
Yeah, hey, how's it going?
All right, so Phil Washington. So those of us who work in the transit advocacy world were very excited when Phil joined LA Metro because we knew of his work in Denver, where they had really been, I think, doing a wonderful job of developing a multi-project system, light rail systems, developed concurrently, and Phil was really leading the way. He had become, I think, a virtual legend in the transit management and development world. So we were very excited for Phil to join us in Los Angeles. And so I'm going to, Phil has some slides I think he wants to share with us.
Yes.
To help us understand where are we now with respect to transit in Los Angeles County.
Great, great. Well, thank you, Denny, and it's great to be here. It's great to see everyone on this virtual, and many of you I'm working with in other initiatives, and so I appreciate that. And thank you for the time this afternoon. Let me start with by saying, as the head of Metro, I really believe in the power of transportation to be able to expand opportunities for LA County. We have said for a long time that that we wanted to step into leadership voids. We wanted to say that we're committed to ensuring that Measure M, the Measure M investment, improves equity across the county. And we've always said that, Measure M and our operations portion of the authority, we're much more than just running buses and trains. We're much more than just a big construction program. What this really is investment in communities, delivering jobs, training programs, small business assistance, grant programs, as well as new transit lines as well. So the slide you're looking at now, very, very interesting. This next gen bus study and the recent expansion of our services such as bike share and micro transit, mobility on demand, all of these things will dramatically change the way people move around Los Angeles. These transportation improvements will allow access to so many things, whether it's education, whether it's jobs, whether it's healthcare. And we are so excited about that. The idea of uplifting disadvantaged and low-income communities is something that we want to do. Like most cities around the country, especially the larger cities, and LA included, the most prominent transportation infrastructure of the past has been our freeway systems. And those freeway systems have, in large part, divided the city. And in many ways, mobility, was an objective in terms of the infrastructure being built. But in some ways, it was in some ways used to divide communities and that sort of thing. This next era of investment, Measure M, Measure R, and other infrastructure programs around the country is aiming to do just the opposite, and that is to connect communities where in the past, especially with the highway system, it was used to divide communities. And so we're doing just the opposite. And if you look at this slide in particular, you see the bus. This is our Orange Line electrification. This is one of our charging stations actually electrifying or charging up a bus. And so we're out there doing that on the Orange Line right now. Next slide, please. Over the last several months, as many of you know, we have been tested by this worldwide pandemic, COVID-19. Our transportation network, we know, is absolutely essential to LA Metro. It's the backbone for our essential workers. We normally, pre-COVID, we were moving 1.2 million people a day. We got down to a low of 275,000 people a day. And now we're back up to almost 600,000 people a day on Metro, and that is growing. So it's demonstrated that people are willing to drive less and walk and bike more. So we are supporting those communities through grant programs to pilot safe streets and allow more space for people to walk, bike, play in neighborhoods as we shelter in place. This COVID-19 really has shined a light on the most pressing issues that we face as a region. And we see now even more clearly that burdens are not shared equally. We're seeing Black and Latino communities that are suffering from the virus at higher rates, that low-income communities and people with poor health are most vulnerable to this pandemic. And then lastly, the economic repercussions of this pandemic have only increased the need for affordable housing and policies to help stabilize communities. Next slide, please. Denny mentioned the equity. Equity is the most central part of the solution, not only to recover from COVID-19, but to the broader pictures of our investments at Metro. A majority of Metro riders are from lower income households. We being LA Metro, has the highest percentage of low income riders in this country. The next closest city or transportation agency is Chicago Transit Authority in Chicago, Illinois, which is my hometown. But while we have the highest percentage of low income riders, we also have the lowest fares of a system our size in this country. And so our goal is to ensure that all residents are within a 10-minute walk of a transit stop. And that is very, very clear in our long-range transportation plan that we have put out over the last 30 days or so. Later on in this meeting, I think you'll hear from Keandra Clara Dodds, who is the Metro's first executive officer of equity and race. She's leading to put Metro's equity platform into action to make sure that race and equity are part of the evaluation process when making decisions on the future transportation network. And she has done great work up to this point in educating our team and our staff on how to use the equity assessment tool that I think she will talk about during this session. Another is really strengthening our relationships with community organizations, advocacy groups, and local governments. In 2018, the Metro Board approved the equity platform, and that provides a framework for how the agency will tackle equity, engage communities, and deliver projects to address these vast disparities that exist in LA County. And we will have the opportunity, as we have presented the equity platform around the country, I think we're going to have the opportunity to share with other communities around the country this idea of an equity platform. We, I believe, have the only equity framework in the country, and we have been touting that. The same year of 2018, our board approved or adopted Metro's transit-oriented communities policy, and that outlines our commitment to partnering with communities to increase transit ridership, stabilize and strengthen communities, engage our partners from visioning to realization, and distribute transit benefits across the region. Next slide, please. Land use and development. We know, and Denny mentioned a little bit of this, the rising cost of housing, along with congested streets, it's really making it harder for residents to afford housing and get to jobs and other daily needs. And so we know that this transportation improvements really can influence investment and development patterns in our various communities. So we want to work with cities on how to develop patterns that complement transit investments. This is why we introduced the transit-oriented community policy in 2018 to look at ways that we could work with communities and to look not just at or around the station area, but to go out in a 2.5 mile radius to look at how we can instigate, to influence, to impact other areas. The idea of affordable housing is huge. We being Metro, we provided $24.6 million in grant funding to cities. And we're in the early stages of creating a technical assistance program for local jurisdictions to help them leverage the positive benefits of transit investment. And just this spring, the Metro Board approved repurposing nearly $1 million for small business loan funds to help and provide emergency relief to small businesses near transit. Next slide. In terms of affordable housing, I know the panel will discuss this today, but this is also critical, of course. The affordable housing crisis and the rise in homelessness compounded by COVID-19 are really pushing us deeper to have deeper conversations about housing, transportation, and equity. In 2015, Metro really pioneered the most aggressive affordable housing policy of any transit agency in the country. We set an aggressive goal that 35% of the housing built on our land would be affordable to households earning less than 60% of AMI or below. To date, Metro has built 2,200 housing units on Metro-owned land through our joint development program, 34% of which are affordable. And right now, we're in the middle of negotiating and entitling another 2,300 units, which will bring our affordability to 37%. So we're not stopping where the severity of affordable housing is so great that we're looking for other ways to do more. So we are re-examining our affordability goals. I've asked our joint development team to re-examine that 35% goal and to see if we can go higher with our objective. Next slide. Some of the streets being special places, creating more vibrant streets. We are creating a active transportation program which provides grant funding to local jurisdictions to improve sidewalks, crosswalks, bike lanes, bike stops. In the next 5 years, we expect to award around $75 million to support pedestrian and bike improvements around the county. We can't improve transit ridership if people don't feel safe walking or biking to the nearest bus stop or train station. Next slide. So in closing, we know this is a challenging time for not just LA County, but for the world, actually. And COVID has put all of us in the struggles of our county here in a magnifying glass. But we believe that with great stress comes focus and creativity. So our staff has shown just incredible resilience and determination to ensure we continue to serve LA Metro in a time of great need. So I thank you for allowing me to share a little bit with you. And I'll turn it back over to Denny. Perhaps we have time for some questions.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much. I do have a question. So I think we are in a position to expect our transit system to largely recover when we all recover from this COVID pandemic. It'll take some time. Voters have supported the system, and so eventually the resources will be back. Mm-hmm. There are really two questions I have. One is Metro started, I think, planning some bus rapid transit program early on. No doubt it's affected by the COVID planning. That bus rapid transit program is really, a high density transit system, high ridership system that might really be a stimulant for some new development along corridors. So I'm wondering whether we can expect that Metro is still committed to that kind of effort. Are we going to be able to think about community development around bus rapid transit lines like we were before?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, absolutely. We are still committed. We're in the process right now studying several new BRT lines in the county. We believe, as I believe you do, that there's great potential to increase reliable transit through BRT. And we want to see development around our BRT lines or along our BRT lines. So we are studying the potential of improving the BRT networks. We have several BRT routes and lines that we're studying, North Hollywood to Pasadena, several others. So we are still committed. It is in the Measure M plan, and I see those moving forward in some ways a lot easier than the multi-billion-dollar rail lines that we have out there. So absolutely, yes.
Okay, hey, Cecilia, want to ask a question?
Yeah, and Phil, it's so good to have you here. You've been such a national leader on this. Along with that BRT network, I think it's important to talk a little bit about the clean fuel aspect of it and you know, your vision for that, because when we talk about social equity and racial justice, we also have to talk about jobs. So Phil, maybe you can talk a little bit about your vision for our clean fuel transit and how that might stimulate job creation here.
Yeah. So I think most of you know that we have set a goal to electrify our entire fleet by 2030. Now, you know, the state mandate is 2040, but you know, my beloved board of directors has said, hey, do it 10 years earlier. So we are on our way to doing that. Now, you know, I've got to say that COVID-19 has set us back a little bit, the sales tax revenue, but we are starting with the orange line, and that was that first slide that you saw. So we have buses coming in for that orange line now. So we anticipate electrifying the entire orange line by the end of this year. And that is pretty much, that is still on track. Now, in terms of the silver line, which will be next, and that runs from, you know, the east all the way down to the south along the 110. We are slightly delayed on that piece because of the revenue shortfall that we have, but we are fully committed to accelerating where we can the electrification of our entire fleet. Now, with that, as you say, comes new jobs. So we are looking at ways in how we can train both existing staff and bring young people on with this new technology. So we're excited about the possibility of electrifying our entire fleet. We want to make sure we invite those on the call to the unveiling for the orange line, which will be next month, you know, for at least our first buses on that orange line. So we have something on the calendar already for the electrification of the orange line.
Hey, Phil, that's great. So listen, I hope you'll stick around with us. I think you'll find the discussion interesting. We want to shift over to the land use side of this discussion. Along these boulevards where BRT or enhanced bus service might happen. And again, the setup here is that we at Move LA believe that the commercially zoned properties along these boulevards are a tremendous opportunity for meeting our housing needs. And you know, proposals in the legislature that sought to have those housing needs in residential areas, which might result in the displacement and gentrification and disruption of existing residential areas, got a lot of blowback. And so we think that there is an opportunity that has not been fully appreciated yet. And Peter Calthorpe and Joe DiStefano from UrbanFootprint are here to share with us some analytic work that they have done with the new tool called UrbanFootprint. So let's see if we can get this set up here. They have taken a look at LA County, assessing the boulevards, and we selected a couple boulevards for some special look. And again, our goal is building housing without displacement and avoiding gentrification and creating new affordable housing as a dominant goal. Peter, are you?
I think I have my slides up. Are they there?
Yeah, there it says, yes.
Good. Okay, you want me to jump in here?
Go ahead, yes, do it.
Well, Joe and I have been working for years thinking about all kinds of growth, and we've done regional plans and pioneered TODs and developed tools. And I've never seen a challenge as big as the one we're facing with the housing crisis in California. And I think that the time has passed for kind of incremental and piecemeal approaches. Obviously, there are lots of things to be done. There are lots of solutions. It'll be a collage, but we need some systemic change if we're going to really deal with the deficit of housing and the price escalation that deficit is creating, which then pushes down on working class and low income people, pushing them out or onto the streets. It is a tragedy that is of epic proportions, and we need to deal with it with big ideas. And so we've been struggling with this question for some time. Look, we know that if you want to supply housing at scale, cost is the issue. Where's the land? Used to be that we would spread ever farther afield into the suburbs. The subdivision was the answer to the first step in home ownership, and apartments were backfilled. But now land supply is short at the periphery. It's too expensive to commute that far. Entitlement costs are going up because we have this endless stream of approval process and adjudications around it. Construction costs have gone through the ceiling. A lot of cities are reticent to have housing because of the fiscal impact. They get less in property tax than they do in service costs. And of course, we need a lot of subsidy for affordable housing. How are we going to solve all this? Then you have the politics on top of that. People are against infill because of the traffic it's going to create. They can't see their way to what was just spoken to, which is an expanding transit network. They see that there are new community services, open space gets overrun, schools are lacking in funding, and of course, what I said before, local fiscal impact. I actually think this Grand Boulevard idea, or Opportunity and Equity Boulevard, whatever you want to call it, it's basically taking really low utilized land, the strip commercial, and converting it into the thing we need most, housing in a good location, close into jobs and services and at the hearts of our community, and distribute it in a way that's really equitable. That's the vision here. The advantages are that we're clustering along the transit, what can be potential transit corridors. We have infill throughout the whole region, and there's no residential displacement. As Denny has said, you know, the part of the failure, the last way of thinking about this systemically was we really cannot, eliminate housing to create housing. We've got plenty of what I call gray fields, commercial land. But we're always going to have to confront the adjacencies. We have to be careful about how infill happens. We have to think through how cities get their costs of services covered. And these corridor improvements are going to cost money. Where is that money going to come from? I know we've all seen places like this, and we imagine that we can have places like this. And anecdotally, many communities are building exactly this kind of thing, but it's episodic, and it's not systemic, and it's not enough. I started working on this with Joe up in Northern California. We looked at El Camino Real, famous, Mission Street. And of course, with COVID, kind of highlighting once again the degree to which a bricks and mortar retail is going to go by the wayside. You have a lot of underutilized land. That's a strip at 120 feet where we can build broad sidewalks, bike lanes, and BRT, and still have room for the cars. All of the above is totally possible in these corridors, and that's where we should focus our energy and our money. So our first study looked at El Camino, 43 miles from the city down to San Jose, and of course, strip commercial the whole way. No mystery what that looks like. Single story buildings, FAR under 0.5, and surface parking lots. A ribbon of community disruption, effectively, and the primary place that we can make a better community, as well as provide housing and transit opportunities. Footprint allows us to look at, well, where are the parcels of land that are not residential, where we're not taking out an older apartment complex that's affordable or stepping into stable neighborhoods that aren't looking to have multifamily next door. And it turns out that the quantity of land along the strip is extraordinary. It's enough for 250,000 households at reasonable densities, at a variety of densities, providing a variety of housing types. We then looked at the 5-county area in Northern California, strip commercial land only. And by the way, only commercial land with FAR, existing FARs under 0.5, which means basically single-story buildings with surface parking lot. We're not touching even commercial land that is highly valuable, employment locations at higher densities, or even kind of industrial zones where our economic backbone has to be maintained. So low density, strip commercial only. And it provides a lot of opportunity for jobs, housing balance, as we have that displacement ever farther to the suburbs. So in the Bay Area, in these central 5 counties, we have 700 miles of arterials, 4- and 6-lane arterials, and 700 miles, therefore, of potential high quality transit. And we know BRT is the most cost effective. That translates, when you look at those parcels of land that just front on the arterials, to almost 1.4 million new housing units and around 350,000 units of affordable housing. Now, we worked with economic planning systems to look at the pro formas and the economics of this. And what's amazing is the property values of that land is so low that it generates very little tax base for cities, counties, and state and education. The incremental tax of redeveloping that would be around $14 billion a year in these 4 counties. Now, if you just take the section of that incremental tax, property tax, that goes to counties and cities, and you created a bond against that income, you'd have $34 billion. So all of a sudden, the issue about who pays or how do we pay for that transit, for that bike lane, for that enhanced school system, a little more open space, and all the community services that cities have to provide when they accept new population, all of a sudden you begin to see that it's a self-funding strategy. And of course, as the point was made, this is an environmental strategy. But by bringing people closer in, water, energy, driving, emissions, household costs, everything gets better in this case. This is not a one-size-fits-all scenario. A lot of care went into thinking through different types of development that are appropriate in different places. We looked at it, small parcels and large parcels, 4-lane frontage, 6-lane frontage, and within TOD. Each one has a different nature and therefore a different kind of housing density and type. And so it ranges all the way from townhouses to apartments and walk-ups, apartments, and of course, at the highest density at the TOD areas. But it starts at this scale, townhouse development along a 4-lane road. It has lofts and live-work as a way of fronting on to these smaller boulevards. Then you have walk-ups, 3-story configurations that get up over 50 units per acre, but are very affordable to build because they're made out of type 5 wood construction. And then of course you start moving up in density when you have larger lots and better proximity to TOD. These are all familiar forms, and quite frankly, they work just about everywhere. As a matter of fact, in Northern California, we tested them across 4 cities. For sale, actually, interestingly enough, didn't pencil out for Hayward and Oakland, but for rent works everywhere. And those townhouses work just about everywhere. So we know that this is economically feasible if we create a kind of as of right, easy path to get the entitlements in place and the construction going. And once the construction happens, we populate and we get higher taxes, and the higher taxes lead to investments. Maybe the next generation of transit. We know, and we're talking about, and you guys are building BRT. The most significant thing here is the right-of-way. Securing a private right-of-way for those people who travel most efficiently. In China, you can see here actually a autonomous bus that's coming online. There's all sorts of exciting new things that are happening. In Singapore, these little minivans, also autonomous, are going on private right-of-ways. So we're going to have a range of things to do. But coming back to El Camino, in that 120 feet, I can, as I said, get all of these features into place. And then over time, those dedicated right-of-ways can be used by different kinds of vehicles that have different economics and different performance metrics. So I think this is something that has to be taken at scale. We need as of right zoning. So it's not episodic. It's not just lower income communities doing it and wealthy communities saying, no, thank you to our fair share of the housing. It needs to have inclusionary. We need to be careful and thoughtful about what happens to the tax increment, because it's a pot of gold that we can use to solve lots of problems. We need to make consummate transit investments. We're not going to add 1 million people into the inner Bay Area, for example, without investing heavily in new transit systems. And so we have economic, social, and environmental benefits. Boulevards of opportunity and equity that Denny's asked us to look into. We've had a chance to work in LA many times and know it well. Years ago, we did some scenarios for SCAG that looked at business as usual growth that looks literally like this versus compact infill that looks like this. This gives you the visceral feel for what at the regional scale, this strategy of reusing those gray fields really would result in. Now I'm going to let Joe move into a whole series of more detailed studies of LA County. Joe, I will stop share and hand it off to you right now.
Thank you, Peter. Maybe one question here as we transition to Joe. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So in your assessment of the affordable housing production, it looked to me you got about 25% assumption there.
Yeah.
So that's primarily through an inclusionary program, am I right?
You know, we're wondering about that. And this is something that could be varied in different places. I believe that every project should have inclusionary, but I also believe that there are nonprofits that produce affordable housing very efficiently, and they do it as standalone projects. So I think we need both inclusionary and housing subsidy for nonprofit builders.
Right. So if a community like Los Angeles County decided that it wanted to be even more aggressive, raise public dollars to invest in affordable housing, then we could even do a stronger affordable element, right?
Well, the idea I'm playing around with is that the as of right carries with it an inclusionary requirement. And then on top of that, the tax increment that comes to counties and cities a part of that could be put aside for affordable housing trust fund and would become a subsidy for those standalone projects. And so you'd be able to mix the two, but you got the money in this, these improvements. You've got the tax base to cover it all.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Joe.
All right, thanks, Denny. Thanks, Peter. So Peter gave this overview, focusing on the Bay Area initially, of the potential of our corridors to take on a substantial bite of housing demand. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn our attention southward towards where most of you are probably, from the Bay Area into the LA Basin. And I'm going to spend a few minutes taking a first order look at the development potential around the 2,000 plus miles of corridors in LA County. So Peter dove into the numbers behind the California housing crisis. Now let's take a look first at how the numbers in Southern California stack up. So stepping back, Peter went over these, but looking at the California numbers again, we know the housing deficit looking forward exceeds 3.5 million new units. We also know that more than 50% of California population cannot afford housing in the state that they call home. So we should think about that for a minute. That means that nearly 20 million people in the state are not able to comfortably afford a place to live. So we hone in on SoCal and we see this region's contribution to the affordability challenge. From 2010 to 2017, the 6-county region added about 1.2 million jobs, but just 160,000 new homes. So the state's latest estimates, which come at us in the sixth cycle of RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, expresses the need over the next 9 years at a pretty staggering 1.3 million new units. So, and what's important to understand here is that more than half of that need is to support moderate and low income households. And just for context here, the median home price across the entire region is about $600,000. So here in LA County, we focus down in from the 6 counties down to LA County. We've added about 1.2 million more jobs than homes over that same period. And we need a minimum.
John, just one word, folks out there. This is Google.
Yes, that is the Google campus. Just for one of the job generators, one of these sort of big job numbers. So again, 1.2 million jobs. 1.2 million more jobs than housing units added over the 7-year period. What that leads to is the need for a minimum of 800,000 new homes to meet needs through 2029 in LA County alone. About 475,000 of that, almost 500,000 units, are needed to serve households in the moderate or below income categories. So you scale further down now into the city of LA, the regional jobs housing imbalance continues now to apply pressure on the market. The need for new units in LA is about 500,000 in the city alone. The median price in the city is about 750,000 today. So with that, well over half the demand for new housing over the period is for affordable housing products. So with those numbers as the backdrop, what we sought to do is get a first order estimate of the development potential along LA County's really pretty ubiquitous strip commercial corridors. So as Peter noted, we deployed our Urban Footprint platform and its built-in data and analytical models to build and evaluate the impacts of a range of scenario concepts. The system makes it easy. It includes data and a kit of parts that allows for rapid testing of this kind of development potential. And it's loaded with parcel and transportation data for the entire region, as well as hundreds of other data sets covering natural hazard risk and demographics and market conditions. And so we leverage all of this data and these workflows to pretty quickly build up the scenarios I'm going to walk through now. So getting back into this topic of the day, the first thing I want to do is actually contextualize LA County today, to really think about how much location and access to transportation options, to transit access, walk access to service and daily needs, how much they make a difference today in things like household cost burdens, transportation characteristics, and even energy and water use, some of the things that Peter looked at in the Bay Area. So most people here are familiar now with the existing transportation network in LA as it stands today. You can see all major rail operations here in color. All those gray lines you see are bus routes. I grew up in LA and I'm actually pretty blown away by how much has been built and how much more is planned, especially if the 2028 plan is still able to make its way to reality given the current crisis. So I know that the COVID crisis, as was noted earlier, is having some impact on development flow, but that it's a bold plan with and a very substantial increase in transit across this region. Here's the 10 million people and the 4.5 million jobs in the county laid underneath this transit. And this is what you're looking at here is all 2.1 million parcels in the county. It's a large place. All those colors represent different land uses and building types. And we're going to get into this more and more. These blue areas now represent all the neighborhoods in the county within a 10-minute walk of the highest quality transit service in the region. Those stops and corridors where buses and trains come at least every 15 minutes. These are the places with the highest levels of transit use, as you might expect, but they also tend to be laid out in more walkable patterns, and we see higher uses of sort of walk and active transportation, as it's known today as well. So more than 2.7 million Angelenos live in those blue zones. And what's interesting now is to look at how these transit-oriented households compare to those living in more auto-oriented locations in the county. These households in the blue zones use less energy and water, they drive half as much, and thus produce far less pollution and carbon emissions, and save more than $7,000 per year in transport costs and household utility bills. Each of these different components, the housing bills, the transportation costs, they add up to impact the affordability of not just a home, and this is really important, but a location, right? So and then on top of that, the variation in environmental impacts is pretty dramatic. And actually this is interesting because this is where state and local goals for housing production and environmental policy start to really overlap and interact. And this is something that we're going to get into more as we move through this. All right, so we're going to get into it now and hit the county and the corridors. And so with this first order understanding of how much location generally matters today, we'll step forward and dive into future development potential across the corridors and how that impacts some of those key dynamics. So we've already taken a look at this existing rail, the existing rail and bus networks. And as was noted, and as Phil pointed out, there's also a fair bit of expansion on the books as well. So the blue lines you see here are the major future transit lines from Metro's long-range transportation plan. And again, I understand the timing of some of these investments could be impacted by the current crisis, but this is what's on the books today, and this is some of the assumptions behind the study we're going to look at now. Okay, so sitting in, through, and all around this transit network are more than 2,100 miles of 4, 6, and 8-lane boulevards. There are almost no communities, literally, that they don't touch or get close to. These are auto-centric corridors that serve as connective tissue for the county and the region. And some of them were purpose-built for cars, and some were actually built for transit in the 20s and the 30s and converted to auto use in the decades that followed the demise of LA streetcar network. Fun fact that, probably most people on this call know, but LA actually had the most extensive rail transit network in the world at one point. And this represents a sort of major step forward back in that direction. Let me see here. All right. So as Peter pointed out, and we looked at the Bay Area study, these corridors come in different shapes and sizes, and they represent thus different opportunities and can handle different types of transportation and development. One size indeed does not fit all. And here you can see a breakdown of the 4 and 6+ lane corridors in the county. Along those 2,100 miles of corridors are nearly 20,000 acres. This is just LA County. So this is far more than the 5-county interior Bay Area. So there's nearly 20,000 acres of low intensity commercial land, much of it being rendered, for better or worse, rapidly obsolete by Amazon and the likes of Amazon, and a trend that is really only being accelerated right now by the current crisis and the pain it's inflicting on brick and mortar retail. So these red areas on the map are retail, office, or vacant parcels. For this study, like in the Bay Area work, we're not including really small parcels or those like under 0.2 of an acre or 8,000 square feet, kind of an average urban parcel. And we're also only looking at parcels with an FAR or floor area ratio of 0.5 or less, which is really a measurement of how intensely a parcel is being utilized or built upon. So in short, what we're looking for here in this study along these corridors are low intensity parcels that are also big enough to redevelop. These are not all expected to redevelop. This study is meant to really provide a sense for just how much development potential there is on these corridors. It's not a depiction of exactly which parcels will or will not convert. It's really let's take a look at what the theoretical limits of this are. So you'll recall from Peter's presentation that there are a variety of moderate intensity housing and mixed use building types that could feasibly be built along these corridors. Densities range depending on whether the new development occurs in or around a major transit line, and also based on the size and width of the corridor, whether it's 4 lanes, 6 lanes, 8 lanes. So you can see now that if you look at all the corridors, the capacity is really quite substantial, up to 1.6 million new homes in the county, more than 500,000 in the city of LA alone. And of course, this is a theoretical sizing of the potential, but even a fraction of this potential is substantial when you look at the need. So let's step in a little bit more. Now, if we just look at the corridors across the county that are in and around major transit investments, the number drops to about 840,000 units on about 9,200 acres across the county, about 360,000 new homes in the city. So you'll recall a few slides back that the state estimate of housing need in the county from the latest RENA numbers is about 815,000 homes. So the corridors actually have the capacity to meet that entire need. Not that they will, but they can. And I think that's an important sort of stat to keep in our brains. And if they did, here's a sense for how that would impact the region and its households. New homes on these corridors would use 40% less energy, minimum, and 2/3 less water. That's enough water savings to supply more than 500,000 homes every year. Households on the corridors would drive at least, if not more, than 1/3 less, which is like taking 360,000 cars off LA County's roads every year. And since they use less energy and drive less, they'll reduce carbon emissions by nearly 40%. These households, same as we looked at in the existing format, they save thousands of dollars a year in transportation and household utility bill costs. You add them all up, that's $4.5 billion per year in household cost savings. And that cost driven by location is a really big part, again, of the affordability the affordability equation. We have to look at the cost of transportation along with the cost of housing and the cost to heat, cool, and water those households. That's a critical part of the overall equation. And this is really where state and regional climate and equity and hazard mitigation goals really start to line up, and the corridors start to look better and better in that view. Where the lines of sort of the housing and the climate crises intersect, and where we can take big bites out of both potentially. And I think, as Peter noted, and I think Denny, you've pointed out as well, if we line up these state and regional policy goals, we can also add a huge inventory of more affordable housing in locations on these corridors that provide better transportation options, put more people within walking distance of services, and really reduce long-term household cost burdens as well. Here's another interesting perspective, actually. It turns out that these corridors avoid, much like in the Bay Area, they avoid most of the major fire and sea rise risk areas in the region as well, as you can see here. So they thread the needle in and through and around most of the critical risk zones in the region. So we've looked at the county. Yep.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I'm just gonna a little bit more here, and just as I jump into some corridors, and then we'll pop back up. So we've looked at the county and the general potential of the corridors across the county. We're going to take just a very brief look at the development potential along 3 sample corridors here. We took a deep dive, or a light deep dive, if you will, into Atlantic, Slauson, and Venice Boulevards that you can see here, and that crisscross different parts of the region. And you can see from this map that these corridors actually cover pretty large swaths of the county. They're served by major transit today, and will be served by many more lines into the future. Current lines, just for context here, are shown in dark gray. The future lines are shown in blue. And then, as was pointed out earlier, these are some of the corridors that are candidates for major bus transit improvements as part of Metro's next-gen bus plan. So we'll start just with a quick tour through Atlantic Boulevard, which is one of the few, at 36 miles long, is one of the few contiguous north-south corridors in the eastern part of LA County. It runs all the way from the mountains to the coast, and it crosses many major transit corridors along the way. And here you can see on this slide, the blue, green, and gold lines cross Atlantic, as does the 710, the LA River. And there's a substantial amount of increased transit service in this area as well, most notably the new West Santa Ana branch light rail corridor, ultimately making its way across Atlantic Boulevard in the future. And you can see that line here in blue. So here's all those different land use colors on all the parcels in and around the corridor, all the people and jobs and services. And here's all the low intensity commercial parcels along the corridor. In all, there's about 350 acres of qualifying parcels that can reasonably accommodate up to 24,000 new homes. And keep in mind, if and when these parcels convert to new uses, they're likely to be reassessed. So we talked about this, right? likely to be reassessed, and thus can provide a substantial tax revenue bump to cities tasked with providing services to existing and new residents. So I think Peter, hearkened to the 14 billion number in the Bay Area. We'd look to see something similar, if not greater, in LA County as parcels convert from single-use commercial into new uses and higher intensities, and even more so with tax increment financing. Zooming in a bit, you can see that Atlantic actually crosses one of the other boulevards we're taking a look at, which is Slauson Boulevard, an area, this kind of intersection here is slated to see new rail service in years to come. You can see that West Santa Ana branch here. And both of these corridors are slated to potentially see major bus service improvements as well. So here's those low intensity commercial and vacant parcels that potentially redevelop over time in this area. And then as Peter mentioned, that there's different flavors of moderate intensity types fit different conditions on the corridors. Lower intensity types on the 4 lanes, higher intensity on larger corridors, and then the highest intensity where you see intersections with major transit. So a lot of different sort of very not one size fits all sort of variety of types that fit in and around these corridors. This is how these different types meet the ground along these conditions: 4 or 6 lanes, smaller, large parcels within rail station areas like here in the lower middle of the screen, which is a new station on the West Santa Ana branch line.
Just to be clear, Joe, you're primarily talking about 4 and 5-story buildings, not high rises.
Yep, you're looking at sort of 3, 4, 5, maximum 7 when you look at a 5-story plus 2 at the TOD in large areas. So, and we're mostly looking at these types, which Peter and his team really worked on quite carefully up in the Bay Area. We're really spec'd in order to sort of facilitate more affordable housing types to make sure these were actually market sensitive and could actually make their way to the ground. Really quite modest. And we're looking at 1.6 million units of potential on all the corridors, 850,000 plus in just the transit corridors, with no building here over 7 stories, and the majority of them far below that, and much more kind of neighborhood sensitive, if you will, than some of the larger types you might see.
Denny, I would add the average, I think, would be around 3 stories for most. And something I didn't mention is that retail still exists. We're not just eliminating all the street level activity. We're providing for ground floor shops, cafes, restaurants, destinations, street activation, local services, all the stuff that communities need. And if they walk in from the surrounding streets, they're going to be greeted with actually more opportunity than they have today.
Right.
Furthermore, I think that it's important when the adjacencies are studied that the building massing step down, especially in relationship to residential development nearby.
So guys, we're going to probably have to move on. Our clock is ticking here, but I think it does need to be said that what we're looking here is development potential. We really haven't yet defined how we do this in a way that does not displace and gentrify. Now, obviously, there is when you divert onto boulevards that do not now have housing on them because they've been commercial, that's an opportunity for housing without displacement. But the issue of whether it becomes a gentrifying force is going to be also largely a function of how you do an aggressive affordable housing strategy as part of this. And I think that's really a lot of a future focus for this discussion as well. Because obviously, if this was all market rate, we might not be interested. If it's substantial affordable, then I think it's a different discussion. So I know you've got Joe Venice Boulevard up here, but I think we're gonna trip over time if we don't move on.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Okay, so I want to call up Kome, Ajise, and Kome. These earlier presentations are really intended to set up the discussion about what's the nature of the opportunity. And what was really interesting to me about what you were showing here is how it compared things SCAG has been saying actually for years. I remember back in 2005 when SCAG released something called the 2% strategy, They said that we could meet all of our regional housing needs on just 2% of the land, doing what you've just suggested, which is building on commercial properties near transit rather than in existing residential areas. So Kome, I guess the baton is passed to you for your observations about this opportunity. Then the others of us are going to start to talk about, well, how can we do this?
Well, thanks, Denny, and great presentation there. I feel like those two presentations, I think, actually sort of give voice to some of the things in our plan and kind of a longstanding position that SCAG has held. I have a few slides to run through. What I'm going to do is, in the interest of time, maybe just focus on 3 slides and not all of them. If we can go to the second slide. So this is a slide I have to show, otherwise I can't keep my job. It speaks to the vastness of the region. And we always, this is things we rattle off, how big the region is and how important the region is, almost half the population of the state. But the focus here is the fact, and I think it was mentioned earlier on too, is the fact that this region has more than 2/3 of the state's DACs, disadvantaged communities, basically. And so the issue of equity is really in focus for us in this region. And we can go to the next, actually the 4th slide, if you don't mind. And so in Connect SoCal, we have this 10 goals that were identified. And I wanted to focus on here because I think this 10 goals speak to the things that both Peter and Joe have outlined. And actually, Denny, you had to say in your opening, and connected with what Phil had to say with transit being a backbone of our planning, at least in the regional planning process that we have. When you take a look at these 10 goals, there are linkages between all 10 of them. They're really connected, hence the diagram. And when you think in terms of healthy outcomes for communities, the safe and healthy environment, improved air quality, community, those speak to that notion of healthy communities and being able to develop land that maximizes the access to opportunities, begin to speak to issue of equity, having diverse types of housing, having mobility choices. And oftentimes when we talk about mobility choices, people tend to think something different from driving your car. But in fact, mobility choices, even within the transit realm, I think it's something to spend some time contemplating. And I think Phil spoke to that a little bit. We have to rethink transit and begin to make transit fit the need of folks out there. The plan also speaks to resiliency in a way. And Joe was beginning to talk about, trying to focus land development, and goes to your question that I'll get to in a minute here, Denny, trying to focus land development as we think about growth, where you have the most infrastructure investment. So hence maximizing your infrastructure and also building some resiliency into the plan, avoiding areas of high risk, which speaks to land conservation and also speaks to disaster resiliency in a way. And so when you take all of this, I think it sort of speaks to what we've come to know as the 3 E's of sustainability, which is equity, environment, and economy. And on the economy side, if we don't do affordable housing, if we don't do it right, we will not be able to sustain our economy. We're going to continue to bleed talent in our region, and we're going to bleed jobs as well. And so building the affordable housing framework and also investing in transportation, I think, are key to maintaining what is the most vital regional economic region in the country, which is Southern California. And we can go to the next slide, which would be my last slide for the conversation. So in essence, the plan as it's cast right now has investments across the 6-county region of about $638 billion. That's looking to focus jobs, housing, and transit in priority areas. Some of the priority areas are coincidental with what Peter and Joe have talked about in terms of the grand boulevards or or what we call livable corridors in our plan. And those linkages are important because it then begins to, I really appreciate the work Joe and Peter have done, because they've given some metrics to this framework of how efficient it is to actually continue to build and focus growth where you already have jobs, and where you have transit capacity and infrastructure. So that's just all the slides I'm going to share for now. So to your question, you did say that you talked about 2%, the 2% strategy.
Yeah, does that still work?
Yeah, it still works, except I think maybe a correction I'll make is it wasn't all of the region's growth focused on 2% of the land. I think we said 50% of households and 50% of employment growth, both of those growth will be on 2% of the land. That was carried through the 2012 plan. I think we've revised that in our current plan. It's up to about 4% of the land because we've expanded quite a bit, and it might shape further. So this is fluid. It's going to depend on a number of factors, but it's intended that you can do similar to what you've just seen in the presentations that we just saw on the livable corridors and the priority growth areas. We basically try to keep most of our future growth and most of our future job growth and household growth in the priority growth areas. I think in our current plan, we're showing about 64% of future housing growth, and about 70+% of job growth will be in those priority areas. And that's, again, trying to maximize the existing infrastructure that we have and to assure that we also keep folks closer to work, so commute sheds are shorter, and we can gain on greenhouse gas emissions. I'm gonna stop there and then see if we.
I'm going to ask Cecilia if she's got a question to pose.
Yeah, I mean, Kome, this is such a great vision, and as you said, Joe and Peter have actually kind of created the proof, right? The proof of concept, at least in their presentation. So I guess I'm asking you, it was a big lift to get SoCal Connect across the finish line. What do you think this type of presentation might build consensus in areas beyond Los Angeles County to further do this type of development and concentrate it? Is this something that people can look at this presentation and see relevancy in places like San Bernardino and Riverside, for example?
Well, I imagine it would. In fact, we sat down with Peter many months ago. I can't remember how long ago now on the presentation, and saw this preview this presentation a while back, and that was exciting at the time. We had just come off a study of downtrend retail in Orange County. We actually did a study, looked at retail that's not quite at their full potential right now because of e-commerce, as opportunities for residential development, and saw similar potential, not quite as granular as both Joe and Peter have shown. And I think the visualization of what the presentation offers, and quite frankly, I think there's a lot of metrics behind it that makes it real and allows folks to be able to understand what it means when you talk density. Right now, we have this arguments that we tend to have in discussions about density, and it's in everybody's minds what density is, and most people hate it. And yet, when you see a presentation that shows the variety of really nice development you can have, that varies from 20 to 80 units an acre, and it can be sustained on some of our corridors. I think that should help bend the imagination a little bit in many other communities.
So my question though is, I don't really care that much about market rate housing development. I really care about affordable housing development.
Well,
when I look at when I look at the RENA plan,
Yeah.
you know, it's a ginormous number of units. It was more than twice the last two cycles combined. Not twice, but more than the last two cycles combined. And I guess it was 58% of the units were supposed to be affordable. Now, yeah, you can get maybe 25% of that share in inclusionary. Don't we need to invest public money if we're going to be serious about the affordable? Peter suggested tax increment as a source. There might be other sources, state legislature. If there hadn't been COVID, we'd have had a $2 billion a year legislative proposal. Local agencies, local governments might do taxes. Don't we need to do that to make this truly affordable housing strategy, an equitable strategy?
There is no, I mean, I'm with you. There is no way we get to affordable or workforce housing production without public subsidy involved. There's just, when you balance the cost of labor and the cost of material and the process costs that we're seeing anymore, you couldn't bend the curve on the cost enough to meet the moderate to low income units that we need. A lot of our jurisdictions are actually producing a lot of housing, but mostly above market, because that's where it's profitable and makes pencils out for a lot of our developers.
Isn't
And
it
so
true?
you'd have to go ahead.
Isn't it true that in the last two cycles that the region has met its market rate targets pretty well?
Absolutely, and I mean that's without question. We've met the market rate, maybe even in some cases overproduced in the market rate.
Right. So we don't really need to do. We don't need to do special stuff for market rate. We need to do special stuff for affordable.
Well, that's where the subsidization comes in. That's where the subsidy comes in, because where the market's helping itself to above market already as it is, but to be able to have units beyond the market at below market and affordable, you have to subsidize it. You know, we're tinkering at the edges. We're working on in some of our communities, we're working on enhanced infrastructure development. Districts to help buy down the cost. Having, I think Peter talked to the issue of tax increment financing, having a wholesale tax increment financing capacity available to all of our jurisdictions so they can use that to, you know, right now we're using mortgage-backed financing to pay for infrastructure on many of our subdivisions. That's how we're paying for infrastructure right now. That should be the role of the public sector, where we have tax increment financing to do that. We used to have that with redevelopment, some would say, and that was taken away largely. So that whole funding source is gone. Recreating that, I think, is part of what we're talking about. But you have to go beyond that. I think it's one thing to have tax increment financing capacity available to jurisdictions to be able to attract developers to build the below market units that we need. We also need some help on the process side, you know, and I'm not advocating getting rid of CEQA, but, you know, we've been able to do some really interesting stuff with CEQA when we actually have infrastructure that we think is critical and we want. Affordable housing has to be seen as critical so that we can give it the same level of attention in terms of process review. So we limit and cap, you know, the exposure that whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit developers have and jurisdictions have, so they can actually produce affordable housing. And you talked about our RENA numbers. You know, when we went to Sacramento as a group from Southern California to try and lobby the legislature, we had three things in mind. One was tax increment financing. Second was to reduce the process load that we have, whether it's regulations or CEQA or even permitting process. And the third was this notion of, could we figure a way to trade and transfer on the RENA side so that we actually get affordable units built where they can be built, with making sure that everybody still has skin in the game. So
Can I jump in here for a sec?
Yeah, Peter, because I think there's not enough subsidy in the world to get us the 800,000 units we need. And I
Well-
noted in your presentation, you made the critical observation that inclusionary was a must-have to achieve
Yeah.
this. You
Well,
want to talk a little bit about that?
You know, I think Kome just got at the heart of all of it. I mean, I've never heard a more concise summary of all the things we need to do. But the reality is we need to think about workforce housing as much as affordable housing.
Yes.
Because as long as we have housing shortages, housing costs too much and it pushes people down and out. And there we have a greater burden on the affordable side. And we've got to combine inclusionary with tax increment, and we've got to streamline the process. And, you know, personally, I'll put it out there. I think we need an as of right for housing in the right place with inclusionary at the right density. And don't forget, market rate housing is largely low density housing. So when you're creating as of right for multifamily on these boulevards, you're intrinsically getting at workforce housing needs and affordable housing needs, intrinsically, all of it.
Okay, so now here
So
we have to
I
move
think you
on.
got to put all these, let me just finish here, Denny, and then I'll shut up for the rest of the
Okay.
session. You know, it's really how all these strategies come together. And I think Kome just painted the picture. It's these pieces and you can mix them, but in the end, what we need is as of right to streamline the process and take the risk out of building housing, reduces the cost of housing because the cost of capital goes down when the risk goes down. There's a, you know, when density goes up, affordability goes up. When proximity to transit becomes more concise, people's cost of living goes down. In the
Well,
end,
I think-
it's not just the rent.
Here, we got you on that one. I think when you start to talk about buy right is when you make the uncomfortable conversation lead over to somebody who directs planning for a really big city. Denny, is that where you were going to go?
Well, I want to talk about another form of risk because we've been looking at the overview from the big picture from the heavens, if you will, the scale of it all.
Yeah.
The folks who are with us now are folks who are concerned about the implementation strategies that actually take place in communities. Their concern is going to be less about the risk to capital and the risk to the developer. Their concern is about risk to their neighborhoods and their neighbors. And we need to figure out how to reconcile so that communities don't bear the risks and the burdens so that the developers can take advantage of the opportunities, right? We need a strategy to reconcile that. We've asked Destiny Thomas to join us from Thrivance Group and help us to ensure that we're taking full cognizance of the issues of racial justice and equity as we try to figure out how to do a implementation strategy for housing along boulevards. Destiny?
Thank you very much. Let me give you a presentation view. Thank you for having me. I am the CEO of the Thrivance Group. We're a new but powerful firm working to provide professional and direct services that facilitate racial justice and equitable access to healthy and thriving communities. One of the things that we've been doing in our work is developing a framework for being an urbanist. And so when I was invited to participate in this conversation, I took the opportunity to sit and think about what an urbanist framing would look like in the context of this proposed approach. And so before I go into that, I just want to clarify that unurbanist is not the equivalent of anti-urbanism or anti-urbanist elements, but it is a call to action to question the racist legacy and unjust legacy of planning and land use planning as we've come to know it. I personally got my start as a transportation planner in 2008 and actually started out as an environmental planner in Fresno with Caltrans with Kome. So it's exciting to be sharing a panel with you today. And if anyone disagrees with anything I say, just blame it on him. But to that end, one of the things that I want to do with the space that I'm taking up today is to facilitate a conversation and to lift up some of the concerns that might be missed by some of the folks who are more focused on the development side of things. And so there are two words that are floating around quite a bit these days, and those words are equity and justice. And those words show up they both show up in this proposal. And so I, for the sake of my discussion points, just want to bring clarity to what I mean when I say these words. And so when I speak of equity, I'm specifically talking about a proportional share of stakeholdership within the prevailing and normative systems. So to me, the work of equity is about baking in equality or equitable access to what already exists, versus justice, which is an active process of making not just the process accessible, but the entire system accessible and participatory in nature. And there has to be, if you're using a word justice, a commitment, a very true and real commitment to redistributing power and decision-making authority, and also a willingness to replace unjust systems when we discover that they're no longer serving us. So actually, before I go into some of the ways I imagine this project achieving these outcomes, I want to talk a little bit about the work that the Thrivance group is doing, and sort of list seven of the things that I think are relevant to this work. So one of the things we've been working on is developing a standardized tool that funding sources, state funding sources and federal funding sources can use to measure, evaluate, and analyze displacement risk, and to identify standardized mitigation efforts. The importance of this is that, just like the words equity and justice have quite a bit of fluidity in our conversation, when we talk about displacement, nobody is really quite clear on whether or not what they mean when they say it is the same thing I might mean when I say it. So we really should begin to rely on some kind of standardized tool for analysis. And so that's a service that we've been providing to municipalities now. Another thing we've been working on is infusing frameworks for dignity-infused civic engagement and participatory decision-making. And while I won't go into explicit detail about what that entails, I don't know if the folks on Slauson would have been comfortable seeing the map that was put up. And I just want to lift that up, as a lot of times our conversations as practitioners can feel very speculative in nature, and could literally lead to speculation. And I'm sensitive to that. And so I want to remind folks that there's a way of going about these discussions while maintaining and upholding the dignity of the communities that we're speaking about. Something that is commonplace in both Los Angeles and Oakland. I'm born and raised in Oakland, but now live in Los Angeles. And one of the things that I've noticed both as a planner and as a resident is that our construction management plans have become less and less, they have less and less fidelity these days. They create a lot of blight, they've created a lot of toxicity in the environment, and they actually add to the environmental injustice that existed before. So I know we saw a couple of slides today about how these projects would reduce toxicity or be healthier for the environment, but we haven't talked much about how the processes, the implementation processes themselves exacerbate environmental injustice and environmental racism. Another thing we're working on is developing racial equity action plans. And I think as our country begins to move toward conversations around racial equity and reparations, the city of Los Angeles, the city of Oakland, the entire state of California should really start to take an interdisciplinary approach to identifying ways to atone for the legacy of slavery, which includes Jim Crow laws, which one of which was redlining, and the issue that we're talking about today, which is our need and shortage of housing, stems from directly from those impacts. And so while we talk about what some of the immediate solutions or what we think are immediate solutions to replace or increase the available housing, we also have to consider whether or not our structures, systems, and decision makers still uphold the values of yesteryear. Another thing we work on is identifying or creating linked transit and housing plans that specifically center anti-displacement as an outcome. And so what I appreciate about today's discussion is that we're doing just that. We are also taking an interdisciplinary approach to proposing policing alternatives. And I know we got a couple of folks on from Metro today. And again, we have to be clear when we talk about building more housing or increasing access to housing along transit enhanced networks, because what comes to mind for people like me is that co-locating transit and housing would directly lead to an increased exposure between residents and police. I mean, if we continue to police transit in the ways that we have. The last thing I want to lift up is that it's really important to have a project development sequence that helps us achieve racial equity in the built environment. And that could be through our quick build projects. It could also be through our housing development projects. But what I mean specifically by that is we cannot talk about building all this new housing and enhancing transit lines without having a serious conversation about the current state of public works infrastructure in our communities. And so I know that there was a quick slide about the communities that were being studied not being within the floodplain, but there are so many other types of public work infrastructure that contribute to poor health outcomes in these same communities that need to be addressed before we invite more people to move in.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Destiny.
Oh, I'm not done.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'll be quick. So I want to talk a little bit about how we get to racial justice programmatically. And these are just my recommendations. I think we should always be building upon the wisdom and perspectives of a broader field of racial justice work. So I would hope to see a more interdisciplinary panel of panelists in the future. But we also should be functionally interdisciplinary. So thinking about what other disciplines need to be present in affordable housing development processes in order to meet the comprehensive needs of the lived experiences of the people who would be living there. Leadership and accountability should remain fluid and responsive to the needs of people being served. And as I mentioned before, there should be a willingness and capacity to replace the entire system, structure, policies, and decision makers if it comes to it. What does this look like in a development process? We need to be careful not to reproduce or encourage model minority prerequisites. And so as we talk about one of the benefits of this approach being that we wouldn't disrupt existing low-income housing or low-income residential areas, we have to think about who would then be inhabiting the new developments and how their introduction to the community would be propped up against people who have lived there prior to them. We should intentionally, we should be more intentional in our role assignments and decision-making processes. So having direct outcomes and measures that are linked to racial justice and environmental justice. Having a commitment to transformative justice, and one of the ways we do this in the Bay Area is through our Second Chance Housing Initiative, which removes the possibility of landlords in new housing developments and old ones of discriminating against people with criminal records to access affordable housing. As I mentioned before, we should be always looking for ways to atone for past harms, not just through individual reparations, but collective reparations in the built environment. And then we should just be, generally speaking, challenging Eurocentric normativity and not asking people to conform to ideals that don't gel with the cultural makeup of the community. Lastly, what I want to offer to this conversation, and what I won't do right now, but is I really want us to think about the assumption that we're making when we say that developing residential units in what are currently commercial zones would automatically reduce or prevent displacement. Again, we should talk about what we mean when we say the word displacement, but also think about how that act would contribute to widening the wealth and income gap. Think about who's moving into the new development. Is displacement inevitable, and how do we address that? Where are our public works challenges? Have we contributed to speculation just by way of this exercise? And also, in this day and age, thinking about the fluidity of the word affordability and determining whether or not our metrics for that are even appropriate for the spaces we're looking to develop. And that's it.
So thank you so much. I think you've laid down a kind of challenge now for some of our next following speakers to measure up to. You use the expression intentionality and restoration. So we've been thinking about an idea for restorative justice in affordable housing, which might then, as a priority, not just make a priority for people who live nearby, who need affordable housing, who might already be at-risk renters with a large share of their income going to rent. But maybe there's an opportunity for trying to restore justice by bringing people who've been displaced previously back to a community. Does that ring true?
I think that is one tool that can go in the toolbox. What comes to mind for me is that the communities and residential areas that are adjacent, these project development zones that we're talking about, continue themselves to experience issues of inhabitability, lack of walkability and accessibility within the neighborhood network, so away from the priority corridors. And without explicitly hearing this conversation happen in tandem with a plan for repairing the harm that already exists in zones that are already zoned residential, it's difficult for me to imagine this being beneficial across the region.
Thank you for your candor. Vince. So,
Kome, what are you laughing at?
I said, that's you, Destiny, just
Yes, it is.
confirming. He said, thanks for your candor. I thought, okay.
That's me.
well, we knew that when we invited you. Vince, all right, so there's a challenge here. I mean, we've been talking about using boulevard commercial land for new development. City of Los Angeles has been doing some of that. We've heard speakers talk about the opportunity that could be there to build housing we need without building an existing residential. And you've been working on that in the City of Los Angeles. Tell us what your experience is. How far down this trail are you? Is this the new model for Los Angeles community development?
And I don't think I
How
need
do we
to
make it affordable and fair?
right. I think I don't need the slide right now. I can just do without a slide since it's a little.
Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I appreciate the presentations, and especially the last one. So the questions about boulevards and how we use them, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that planning's fundamentally about communities and people. I think that Phil Washington mentioned in his presentation about how infrastructure and roads have done great harm to communities in our history. I think it's important to just acknowledge up front that. I think it's important to acknowledge that the history of zoning as it's related to systemic racism and injustices. I mean, we have a legacy of 400 years of great harm done to Black people in America through our laws and our systems, and zoning is part of it. It's been part of largely that last 100 years. And I think that we have to acknowledge it's not just the zoning systems, but it's also the way we planned our infrastructure in ways that have done great harm to communities. I think that in many ways, boulevards sometimes have done great harm to communities in the past. And so there's something to really acknowledge as part of that, and how we think about our boulevards as a way to, in this particular way, bringing people together and communities together. I think that when we're looking at these, we need to be looking at this idea of the communities that they serve, first and foremost. It's hard for us to kind of talk about these great planning efforts when we've noticed in the past that great planning efforts and great ideas have done harm to communities, direct harm. And so I think that there's something that we need to be very careful when we look at these large initiatives to see how they carry out in particular places, and especially our communities of color, especially in communities that have been underinvested in so long. So I think there's those aspects that have to first and foremost be considered. The city of LA has had a long-term practice of allowing residential and commercial areas, and I think displacement means many things to many people, and I think that's why it's important to define it up front. That's why I appreciate those comments, because displacement isn't just about, it's a very complex and sensitive issue. Displacement isn't just about displacing a person who may be living on a piece of property. It may be indirectly displacing someone who may live nearby, but it's also maybe displacing a business that may be providing jobs locally or services locally to an area where it is difficult to get around. The people who have more difficulty of just navigating the city through because of transit services. So displacement is a very complex terminology that I think that we should really think about. I also think that it's hard because what's creating displacement isn't always what's happening on that piece of property or in that neighborhood that you're looking at. It may be happening, it may be caused by things that are happening all over your city. And I think we need to take a deep, hard look, especially in a city like Los Angeles at 460 square miles, and ask ourselves, not just what are we doing in these communities that are at risk of displacement, but what are we doing everywhere else? And how are we creating these forces, if you will, that result in displacement throughout the city. So it's a big, complex issue that we've had in the past. And I think it's something that we need to address. There are many times that we can unknowingly perpetuate policies that have been going on in the past that can do great harm to our community. So there's this idea of looking internally at them, which I think is really important. And I would say that our plans need to be very nuanced. And when we plan locally, our struggle sometimes is the plans that cross throughout the whole city, and what's the result of those actions. And we've had one project with one policy which has created a lot of housing and affordable housing is our transit-oriented communities incentives. And that is something that was an outgrowth of Measure JJJ. Was actually written into Measure JJJ, largely written by ACT-LA, which is a broad-based coalition of organizations that are very community-based, and they deal with grassroots organizing, community economic development, housing development, public health, environmental justice. These are communities such as Kome Beautiful, Sage, ELAC, a variety of organizations that have spent decades working in our communities to come up with these incentives. And then we work closely with them to develop them. And we've seen change throughout them. And I think we've seen a lot of growth in our housing and our affordable housing, but we also have to be looking at things in a more nuanced way. I don't know if it's just about affordable housing, but it's what are those, it's not just that we're building a certain amount of housing and a certain number of income levels. We have to look at some things like how many bedrooms are they? Are we taking areas that have 2 or 3 bedrooms units, which can really house one or more families, to one that's just a studio and a 1 bedroom? What are we doing with open space and where people have access to recreation on the properties? And so those are some of so are we not just introducing in commercial areas, but how are we actually introducing housing that is really needed by the community around it, that feels very much supportive of the community that it's being built in. So those are the things that I think that we need to really be looking at as a city, and so I think an important thing is, it was raised before, is really having, some, if you will, to being able to look at development projects with this equity lens as they come across each and every one of them, as well as how we look at our policies as we develop them, and being able to have that kind of nuance to our individual neighborhoods. I think that there's definitely possibilities on our neighborhoods, in our corridors for this, but I don't know that we have to think of them as not as these kind of strings moving through our city, but these places that are part of individual neighborhoods and communities, and those communities that are around them. We also have to think about not just how do we create plans, but then how do we implement them? How do we bring them alive in a very community-based vision? We don't necessarily have the financial resources we may have in the past to do them. And so that's going to be part of it. And I think some of the speakers here have alluded to it. I think there is a strong connection that we have to have between how we plan transit and how we plan our communities. When I came on board several years ago, I was so happy to have Phil Washington and then Therese McMillan spend the time to really talk about they don't feel like they're just planning transit networks, they're planning whole communities. And I think that's really important. So I'll just kind of maybe leave it at that if you have some more questions, because there's a lot more voices I want to hear. And I'm sure everyone wants to hear too.
Thank you, Vince. This might be useful. Lauren Cencic is with us from Metro and Cheese, primarily responsible for Metro's BRT program. And my wonder here is, given what's been said now, how she might see the BRT system being a source of solutions and opportunities to resolve these challenges. So Lauren? What's going on?
Yes. Thank you so much. And I'm really pleased to be here today as a part of this discussion. I do have a few slides I'd like to share kind of about some of the efforts that we're doing as part of BRT. But just to kind of start with answering your question, Denny, is that really, we're very interested at Metro in looking at kind of all of the tools in the toolboxes, and really, as Vince alluded to, really looking at how land use planning and some of these challenges we're looking at fits into with the transportation, the transit, and the mobility planning that Metro is doing as an agency. When Phil started his opening remarks, really talking about how, we are committed to looking at our transit investments and how they're integrated into the community, and really doing sort of building partnerships with the local jurisdictions who actually have the control over the land use, and not Metro, is really a key and vital part of what we are doing as an agency. So let me share my screen here real fast. Okay, so one of the things that I am working on is the BRT Vision and Principles Study. And the BRT Vision and Principles Study is really meant to be, provide some kind of overall guidance and support for how we're looking at BRT in the county. And as we've talked through this whole panel today, BRT is not the only solution when we're looking at enhanced transit along these corridors, and how that transit would really help support other community goals and community development goals, including affordable housing. There are other solutions, but I think BRT really provides a key solution that needs to be a part of the conversation. So in terms of this study, we're really doing a couple of things, and one of which is really defining bus rapid transit, setting a standard for what that means in Los Angeles County. One of the things for BRT to really successfully deliver some of these benefits is it needs to be done well. So we need to really set forth kind of those standards for what that BRT is, so that we have a common set of talking points about BRT and what does it mean for a community when we're looking at it. In addition to the 4 corridors that were identified in Measure M, Measure M also identified some program funds for future BRT corridors. So this study is looking countywide for opportunities for where we could best utilize those Measure M funds. And we're really supporting those Measure M projects through design standards, design criteria, And then really looking at this from a network approach, not only what are the first corridors we should build with those program funds, but how do we grow that into a comprehensive network that really helps serve the entirety of the county and really leverages the investment we're making in our other corridor projects, including the rail network. When we're talking about BRT, we are looking at really a little bit of flexibility, looking at how we can accommodate the complex geographical and political constraints of LA County. There is not one solution that fits all. And I think, one of the things that I think is very key, and if I have to guess, I'll guess that Kendra, who's coming up in a little bit, is going to talk about this a lot more. But this means really thinking about our projects through an equity lens and really making sure that very extensive community engagement is done so that we're applying the right transportation solution to the right context. And then that transit solution is really married with the right approach in terms of land use and other community planning that really is right for each individual situation. When we're defining BRT, we've used that to develop some standards, and we've done something a little bit different in LA and Metro, in that we're really focusing on both prescriptive and performance standards. Most of the definitions and standards of BRT are really focused on infrastructure. How many miles of dedicated lanes do you have? Do you have dedicated stations? What does the branding look like? We're looking at that, but also really looking at it more from a performance base and what this means for the users of the system. We want to make sure that the on-time performance, the frequency with which it comes, the bus speeds are something that are really front and center, and that what that really translates to is that we are applying the right infrastructure tools in the right spots where they're needed the most to deliver the most benefit, rather than saying, hey, we've delivered a BRT because we have put 50% of bus lanes along 50% of the corridor. They just happen to be the easiest spots and not where they were needed the most to really provide those benefits. So we're really looking at sort of this merging of how BRT looks and also performs. We've developed design criteria on a number of pieces of it, from operating standards, what the stations look like, ITS, running ways, branding. But one of the things I really want to draw your attention to is we're really focusing on thinking about BRT and how BRT would work with transit-oriented communities. Really thinking about putting BRT in, how do we work with communities to make sure that we're able to really realize the benefits of that transit investment, but we're really also delivering kind of the vision that the community wants to see. So that's everything from walkability, bikeability, urban design, the intersection with land use and housing, and really just making sure that we're not just plopping transit lines, whatever mode they are, whether BRT or rail or anything else, down on a street and walking away. That Metro really sees us as having the responsibility of developing partnerships with the local jurisdictions to make sure that those transit investments are leveraged the best way possible. And really the key is, Metro does not own the right of way. We do not have control over land use planning, and nor should we. But what we can do is we can start these conversations very early with those local jurisdictions and with the community, and continue them all the way from early planning processes all the way through the implementation of a project. Stations are the easiest and prettiest to show, so I did want to show a little bit of a rendering of a station. This is kind of what we're thinking about. But one of the things I think, if you really want to invest in full BRT, is to really think about how stations fit into the design and the urban fabric of the corridor that you're looking at. How can they promote walkability and really not just be something that's sort of plopped there? So we're looking at pretty simple solutions, but that for stations, but also those that really provide a sense of permanence and investment as well. To me, it's not a BRT if you're just throwing a sign blade up on a pole and saying the bus stops here. We're also looking at really, screening corridors to identify those first investments, but also developing sort of this longer term visionary network for where we'd like to have a future BRT. And we've been looking at a ton of criteria, both in terms of prioritizing corridors, but also really thinking from a network approach. One of the key things that we've heard over and over again from our stakeholders is that, we don't want to think about lines on a map as individual lines. From a mobility perspective and from a transit perspective, we're really looking to create a network. In the early discussions, Joe was talking about really kind of some of the intersections of corridors with other lines. And I think that has to be a part of this conversation. Our goal isn't to get people from the north end of the street to the south end of the street. Our goal is really to connect people with where they live to their destinations. So we have to think about these corridors in terms of how they fit together as pieces of an overall puzzle. Obviously, ridership potential has been a part of our screening criteria. It's important. I think land uses and really what those land uses are and how supportive they are for transit is a key piece of prioritizing corridors. We've been looking very closely at equity and then trip length. And by trip length, we really mean how far are people traveling, because different types of trips are better served by different modes. And BRT isn't the solution to all trips, but we're trying to find those corridors where the types of trips that people are making would be well served by this type of service. Really looking at existing conditions where we have the opportunity to provide those benefits that BRT could be. And so that does lend itself to kind of some of these boulevards and corridors. BRT, frankly, just doesn't work that well when you've got one lane in each direction, because a big part of BRT is providing those speed improvements to buses. So we are looking at corridors where we can really focus on providing that infrastructure and providing those promised benefits that we would live up to the promise of our new definition of BRT. And really looking at how do we fill in gaps? How do we provide that connectivity to places that don't have it? How do we leverage not only what we have on the ground now in terms of our transit network, but how do we look at what we're planning in the future? And really, focusing on how these corridors and these investments fit into the community and the community's goals. So I was brief. I want to make sure we save time to get back to the larger conversation about, affordable housing and the intersection, but I did want to just provide a little snapshot into the BRT tool in the toolkit.
Thank you, Lauren. I think that's a really good setup for talking with Gateway City leaders, because their corridor, Atlantic Boulevard is a corridor and gateway, and the Gateway Cities is a part of the region that I think is very actively planning for transit, for enhanced transit services. So maybe Nancy Pfeffer would be game to jump in here and give us a bit of your observations about what this conversation might mean for your region you serve.
And Denny, we've got about 5 more people and half an hour. So maybe we can go to kind of top lines and lightning rounds, because you've got an amazing group of people who could really dig in on some questions in a lightning round. Like Nancy, straight up, can you imagine your cities actually accepting the elimination of R1 zoning, a whole lot more affordable housing, more density? I mean, I'm just kind of curious, just from the top lines, just to try to get it going. What do you think of some of these visions? And then to Destiny's point, this is about participatory planning. So this is very top down in its visual, in its conception, but the communities you have are very distinctive, smaller cities, each have a unique history and a unique set of political players. So how does this work for a place like the Gateway Cities? Sorry, Denny, I just wanted to break it up a little bit.
Well, thanks, Cecilia. You just kind of made all my points, but I do want to show a few images and make some of those points again in just a tiny bit more detail. I don't know, Eli, if you're able to show, I have a little video, and if you don't mind looping it, or I think there's a repeat at the bottom right, and it's just some images of the Atlantic corridor as it exists today. So if you could show that while I talk. You know, Cecilia, you really raised a lot of the key issues that I've been jotting down and preparing to talk about. And I think when Vince spoke, he really highlighted the difference between you know, a city like LA and all of the many, many cities that we have in the gateway cities. I want to just read you along the Atlantic Boulevard corridor in our region. The cities on that corridor are Bell. This is just in alphabetical order. It's Bell, Commerce, Compton, Cudahy, Long Beach, Linwood, Maywood, Southgate, Vernon, and the County of LA. So that's 10 different local jurisdictions. So when we want to talk about a corridor planning, you absolutely have to recognize that each of those jurisdictions has its own elected officials, its own general plan that has been through a public process that's been supported. And absolutely, when you start to talk about you know, regional plans or state bills that are going to impose rezoning requirements, that's very, very touchy. I want to also describe these communities just a little bit more to you. It's not really evident from these photos I'm showing you, but these are incredibly dense communities. And I want to share also some of the information. We have pulled together our population densities. The list starts with New York at 27,000 population per square mile. Our list, you've got Maywood, Huntington Park, and Cudahy, all below New York and above San Francisco, which is at 17,000 population per square mile. So we've got 3 cities that land in between New York and San Francisco in terms of their population density. And 2 of those, Maywood and Cudahy, are on this corridor that you're seeing. And 3 more, Linwood, Bell, and Southgate, are not far behind in that ranking. What we have in terms of residential patterns is a lot of very crowded. You might see single family housing if you drove through, but know that there are multiple families in those homes. Know that the garages are all converted, legally or not. There is a huge amount of density crammed into these areas that look very low rise and very single family. And the result of that, it's a very auto dependent community. Parking is really at a premium because the transit network is such that people absolutely prioritize getting access to a car. And as soon as they can do that, they have the mobility they need. And that means that parking is essential. So you talk about doing some kind of enhanced transit, enhanced bus or BRT on these corridors, and you can see kind of the physical plant that we're dealing with. And I don't want to sound like it's not possible. So please, you know, I hope you don't take it that way. I think that we do see, I was very intrigued to see Peter and Joe talk about the benefits that could be had. Those absolutely are very attractive benefits for lower household costs and lower transportation costs. But just know that we have to go through a very focused process in working with cities. I want to raise one other very critical point, which has to do with tax revenue. And the way that cities are able to provide services to their residents. When we're talking about bringing in additional residents, that is not necessarily a bad thing. And we absolutely know we need affordability, but also please understand that all of these little cities that I read out to you, I don't think there's a one of them on that list other than Long Beach that gets more than 10 cents on the dollar of property tax revenue in that city. It all goes other places. And what we did at the direction of our board was actually to recommend an incentive approach so that our cities could, when they rezone a commercial property along such a right of way to residential, they would be able to keep that property tax in the city to have the revenue to pay for new residents, pay for those services, apart from the part that goes to schools. So we are hopeful of trying to get that actually moving through the legislature, and that kind of incentive would be really essential to make a process work other than having it imposed on us from a regional or a state level. So I think those are all my main points. I could go on and on. I'll say one other thing, Denny, you acknowledged that we are doing planning along these corridors with these cities. We're engaged right now in a complete streets corridor plan with the cities along Atlantic. It's our third one. We've done 2 other arterials, and we have many more queued up, including Slauson. And the process involves bringing the electeds together at the beginning, working very closely one-on-one with the city staff, and bringing the electeds back together at the end. And we should have an output from our Atlantic corridor probably around middle of next year. So I'll stop there, but hopefully I've made the point that there is a lot of complexity in working with multiple small jurisdictions. There's absolutely potential here, but we also have to recognize the local issues and the fact that there are multiple jurisdictions here.
I just wanted, one thing is the visuals you provided really show the type of underinvestment in amenities that Destiny was talking about. These are communities that desperately need trees. They desperately need clean water, open space. They're extremely dense. So something truly transformative that's community driven is what it's going to take to make a difference, because you've got to grow a massive amount of public support over some of these ideas you're talking about, Nancy. It's really going to take that. So you guys are trying, but it's tough. It's tough in this corner.
Let me add one other essential piece that has not been mentioned at all, and that's broadband and internet access. For heaven's sake, this is so crucial. I don't care what kind of job you do. If you're going to learn at home, if you're going to find a better job, whatever it is, even if you have to be physically at your job and you can't work remotely, I don't care. Broadband and internet access is incredibly important for these communities. So I just want to add that into the mix when we talk about these kinds of investments in corridors.
New with Thrash, don't you live near Long Beach, Atlantic Boulevard in Long Beach? You know this corridor pretty well, don't you?
I do. So Denny and Cecilia, thanks for this conversation. There are very few places that we could hear from Joe and Peter and Destiny and Vince and myself and all of the other great folks who are here today. And now that I'm in the conversation, let me tell you sort of where my head is at this moment and what I want to talk about, and part of why I come to this conversation. So I come to this conversation with the obvious titles, right? The obvious title is, I've been a developer. I know what it's like to try and assemble a bunch of commercial small properties to try and do some work on the boulevard. I come to this conversation as a financier, as someone who is looking at, trying to finance affordable housing and saying, shoot, we only have one source. It's really only the low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC, and it's not enough, and it's not producing the amount and the kind of housing that we need for communities. The part of the conversation that's not as obvious as to how I come to this is that I grew up in those neighborhoods in South Central Los Angeles, along one of those, wonderful tree-lined, to some extent, streets that was actually had a commercial corridor that has never really thrived. My grandmother never saw that commercial corridor thrive. My mother never saw that commercial corridor thrive. And I never saw that commercial corridor thrive. And I have children, and they have not seen that commercial corridor thrive. And there is work to do to see opportunities. But the two areas that I come to, the more obvious one as a developer, yes, it's going to be hard to assemble this. How are we going to do this? How are we going to incentivize getting the land together? And how are we going to finance it? But I'm only willing and interested in solving for those things if we can move and look at the equity and justice that needs to take place as the reason to solve this. So for me, solving this is about, yes, can we develop along the corridors? Okay, let's solve for that. But in solving for that, I want people, not just in this community, to live in that housing. I want them to build it. I want them to own it. I want them to be part of designing what it looks like. And so that's the piece of the conversation that I think is still really critical as well. I'm motivated to solve it, but I want to see the people who have lived along these, intersecting streets and these single family homes for all this time. I want to see them be able to be part of actually being on the workforce and building this housing and this multi-sector kind of developments we want to see on the corridor. I want to see them be part of some level of ownership, right? So why can't the people who are in these neighborhoods also own the commercial corridors and the new activity that is going to be happening there? I want to see us think about these commercial corridors, not just as places where people are going to rent, but how do we make sure that people in this community, people of this community, get a chance to look at some of the models around community land trust and other opportunities of ownership, and they access the equity that's needed in order to own this, so that we don't have to have the gentrification conversation, because people can now self-determine in a new way about what is going to happen. So, you know, those are the things that, you know, we haven't had the developer on, so they haven't been able to talk about how hard it is to you know, bring these parcels together and how small they are. We've got to get our design friends on here. And I love that we were shown, Peter, you showed us the different scales, because some people just can't even imagine what the various scales can be in terms of housing. We can have low density along the corridors. We can have higher density. It just depends, and it will fit into whatever the community of that particular area is interested in. So yes, I'm interested in talking about how to activate the boulevards. There's a blue ocean opportunity there, but in order to solve for those hard things, I want to see what is our plan to ensure that equity and justice is met, and that we're not just renters. People are not just, we're not just concerned about whether they're going to rent. We're talking about how are they owning and how are they self-determining what is happening on those corridors.
Can I hear wealth generation?
Yes.
Thank you, Tunua. Thank you. So, Joan Ling, now you've been a developer of affordable housing in Santa Monica, and you were on the redevelopment agency in Los Angeles. So you've had lots of experience with getting affordable housing done. Is this idea of moving our attention to the development of housing on commercial boulevard land, does this intrigue you? Does this scare you? Is this workable?
You're muted, Joan. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thanks, Denny, for the question, and hi, everybody. I want to spend half a minute putting the question into context. McKinsey did a research report 4 years ago and said that California has a $50 billion with a B, $50 billion per year affordability gap. If you figure that Southern California is about 40% of the population, has 40% of that gap, that's $20 billion a year that we're short, that we need to bridge that gap. And if you capitalize that amount, we have a $400 billion nut to crack, capitalized. So $400 billion nut. To look at it another way, SCAC estimated that we need to build 1.34 million housing units over the RHNA period. That amount is 5 to 6 times more than historically what we have been building. So how are we going to get all these units built? On top of that, and Denny alluded to this already, 60% of that number of units have to be affordable housing, below market rate affordable housing. So how are we going to get there? So my answer to your question, Denny, is yes, absolutely. We need to densify. We need to put a housing, multifamily housing, 3 stories, 5 stories, 7 stories, affordable housing and market rate housing in these commercial corridors and commercial cores. But it is one of many strategies and tools that we need to deploy in order to really address the issue, or else we'll be like taking a knife to a gunfight. Having said, I hate to be a downer, and having said that, I do want to point out a possibility. So California is a $3.2 trillion GDP economy, $3.2 trillion a year economy. Historically, over the last 4 decades, labor share of that GDP has gone from 65% to 60%. If we move the needle back just 1%, that is $32 billion a year. That is will be put into the pocket of workers. Now, I'm not saying that we should distribute it equally so that Snapchat software engineers would get, you know, some of that extra money. I'm talking about really distributing in a fair and equitable and just way so that low income people will get more of the fruit of their labor. So that is a solution, in addition to building very much needed housing in these commercial corridors and commercial cores.
Did I hear redistributive justice? That's what I thought I heard.
Yeah,
the
I'm
bookend with
like scared of these terms because I'm not really sure what they really are, but you know, that's how I think. That's whatever it is.
I love it.
well, redistributive justice and restorative justice have a lot in common.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so again, we want to be conscious of our time. And Ramel, here you are. All these housers talking about and the transit folks talking about, and you're a bike advocate. Do you see opportunity here that might transformative in nature, for example? I mean, we've been working very successfully at making the case for enhanced bike activity and bicycle use in Los Angeles County. There's been more money created, but there's been a lot of disappointments in the local planning. Can these boulevards of equity and opportunity address some of this concern?
Yeah, let me start by saying we're not only a bike type of organization, we're really community organization, multimodal, walking, pedestrians. I just want to show two pictures, and it's partly because I want to show people. You know, we haven't seen people in a long time.
Thank you, Ramel.
And I feel like this is Hollywood and Vine at a cyclovia day. And then the next slide is Central Avenue in South LA, which was just this past February. And you can take the slides off now. I just wanted to reinforce that, you know, the work that we all do really focuses on people. And I really appreciate the work that Destiny has done and, you know, historically has done for the past several years, really pushing for these issues in the city. And, you know, Tunua, if folks don't know, she and I worked together way back when she was still an intern and talking about these issues of environmental justice and social justice. And if there's anything that cyclovia has taught me or taught us is this whole notion that there is an appetite, no matter where you live, no matter, you know, how you get around, there's an appetite for these different types of modes of transportation. Right, and you saw two places, very touristy, Hollywood and Vine, to South LA, Central Avenue, and what was really common was a sense of joy, right? And I always try to frame this notion of, you know, when we talk about boulevards of equity and opportunity, what would it look like if we made well-being and joy a human right as much as all of the other issues that we all struggle with to try to push forward. And what I love about the topic, Denny, is that, you know, you begin with equity and opportunity as the baseline. You know, that's the floor by which we're going to, it's not something we're gonna, that's where we should start. And if we start our local policy and all of those in that framework, I think about the UN did a happiness report. I don't know, if folks haven't read it, read it. It's actually pretty good. And, you know, we talk about these places that are innovative, and they're usually, you know, Denmark and the Netherlands and Sweden and all those other places. And I always think LA is one of those places that is so innovative. You know, it's a young city. If you think about it, we're 250 years old, and other cities are 500 years old, you know, in terms of and we're still young in that whole notion of innovation and creativity And what would it look like if we spent that time making equity and justice part of that innovation? Like, what does that look like? And if there's anything that Ciclavia has done is it's made things like the city of LA and the region, which is very car-centric, we made it look like what we feel. You know, we feel that notion of not just riding a bike, but walking in these streets that we own. These are public streets. You know, what does it look like when you have hundreds of thousands of people that are civically engaged to begin to reimagine? And, you know, while we haven't had a Ciclavia in a bit, you know, because of the COVID environment, there is a sense of collective action that I think the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement has really hit home, which is this collective action that it's all about understanding the things that we weren't so comfortable in talking about and making it very deliberate. Ciclavia was a deliberate effort to take cars off the road. And what would the city look like? Well, there you go, 35 events later, 250 miles later, we can kind of see, and we hope that that reignites imagination. And Denny, so I think your question is, can something like this happen with the boulevards of equity and opportunity? Absolutely. I think there is a way to do it. And it's what Tunua said, and I think what Peter said, which was, it's about building unlikely partnerships across the board. What does that look like? You know, I remember I spent eight years in City Hall as deputy mayor, and some of the things you have to do are things that you don't necessarily, it's not the obvious partners that you bring folks together to get something done. And if there's anything from that experience that I think is really important is public participation. The model that we've used in the past has been this DAD model, DAD, right? Decide, announce, defend. That's got to be thrown out. And I think that, you know, I'm still optimistic and hopeful. And boulevards of equity and opportunity, if we can make it happen, it's got to be done throughout the city. It's got to be across the board. And we begin in places that are most in need.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Keandra, we've had a couple hours here with various people talking. We've tried to raise up equity, racial justice in our discussion. What extent do you think we've succeeded, and how have we failed? What would your advice to us be if we want to get it right?
Well, thanks for the question, Denny. I mean, I've enjoyed listening to this conversation. I think there's been a lot of great points raised about how to make this work. There's so many things to consider. You know, just the way we engage communities to really understand what this could realistically look like and how it could support their needs. Whether some of the areas that we're looking at, you know, how do we consider the environmental impacts of bringing in additional housing when they're already not, you know, set up to support the housing and people that live there now, et cetera. I think this is interesting when I think about it from, you know, so much of this part of the conversation is focused locally, but from what I understand of your proposal, you know, it's a statewide proposal. But I think truly to make it effective, you do have to figure out what it would look like and how you implement it on the local level and what those partnerships are and whatnot. I think there's some interesting voices and perspectives that also should be included that we haven't touched on in more detail. When I first heard about the proposal, one of the initial thoughts I had was, okay, we're talking about residential displacement, but what about business displacement and small businesses, minority-owned businesses? How do we protect them? When we think about ownership models and allowing people that are in these communities to be able to own homes, own properties, what about the businesses as well? Because so often when we bring in investments, whether it's transportation or others, the minority-owned businesses who often don't own their properties get displaced. So we need to make sure this conversation is is broad enough to include all that may be impacted. I think there's so, I don't know, this is a really, I love how this was presented as far as thinking outside of the box and how do we, I think there's just much more conversation to be had as far as figuring out next steps. But I think, you know, I just appreciate the breadth of what has been shared as far as things that we need to acknowledge and explore as we move forward. And I also appreciate the interdisciplinary approach to the work. I mean, it really will take, you know, planners, architects, community members, Metro, et cetera, to make something like this work. But I think it's worth it because I think, you know, to solve the issues that we're trying to focus on, is especially affordable housing, we do have to think about these big picture, out of the box ideas and not continue the traditional models that we've had that, you know, we haven't solved the problem using them. So you know, I'll just end with saying I appreciate the conversation. I think there's so much potential to go with this work and with this idea. And I'll say, in the context of other big ideas that have been proposed at the state level before, I think having these types of conversations and even going more deeper into conversations with grassroots communities will really be what it takes to make it successful. I think, you know, top-down approaches, they don't tend to work. We see that over and over, but we really have to work with the people that are impacted to figure out what's going to make this work as we move forward. So I'm just saying about that.
Thank you, Kendra. I would like to say there are a couple pieces of legislation that get into this area of allowing multifamily development on commercial property and boulevards and downtowns, but they're not all getting it right. I'm particularly concerned, well, I won't get into any particular bill yet, but there are two bills right now, and I think they need to be, we need to all look at them carefully and make sure they get it right, because I think they start with the right premise, but they become then, you can see the fingerprints of the ambitious developer all over them, rather than the community that wants a place to safely live. And that's a problem. So, you know, we think about this both locally and statewide, but we don't trust statewide to get it right.
That's a great point. That is such a great point.
So, hey, folks, listen, thank you so much for your time. We have, you know, we've had more than 300 people here at the end. We had 550 at our apex or so. So it's been, I think, a pretty good audience for this discussion. This is, you know, better than the conferences used to get. So maybe there's a feature in the Zoomposium. Cecilia, how about you? You want to say something?
Yeah, I really love what Romel said about getting away from dad planning, right? And I'm proposing mom planning, which is meaningfully organize and mobilize. I also want to say, let's not lose the thread. Tunua, thank you so much for pointing out there are corridors that have never worked as meaningful commercial corridors. There are others like places in the Gateway that are super vibrant commercial corridors, the heart and soul of the community. So it's not one size fits all. I think that really what Peter and Joe did was say, you got to have a fine grain. This is give you an overview and a vision, but it takes community-driven planning to get us the right result, because ultimately it's going to be a huge political lift to get us the money we need and the zoning tools we need to make this happen. And gosh, we actually need some federal money to jumpstart this. We can't do it all on ourselves in our cities, especially in a place like California. So Denny, thank you so much for letting me be a part of the conversation. I miss you guys so much. I can't wait.
Hey, Nancy Pfeffer wanted to say something at the end here as well. Nancy?
Thanks so much. Oh, I see Tunua has a visitor there, I guess. Hi. Hey, I just wanted to say, I wanted to ask, don't pass us by because we look like we're going to be hard to work with, okay? I really want to ask Metro in setting priorities in Move LA in the areas you consider. I'm really grateful that you did include us in this conversation. Let's work on a better process so that we aren't so hard to work with, but that we can really benefit. And I was saying to Eli also on text, I would love to see a follow-up event where we really talk about what are the new processes we need. And we have the collaborators here and more that can really design the mom planning instead of the dad planning. What does that look like, particularly in the era we're entering now? So thanks for letting me have that word.
I'm writing more plan again.
Critical. West Santa Ana branch is going to be a game changer. Now we just got to give you the tools to make the most of it.
Please, please, please. Yes, I didn't even get a chance to talk about that, but absolutely incredibly important to us.
All right, so listen, thank you all for joining us. We've got a robust audience. We appreciate very much the information that we've received. This has all been recorded, and it'll be up on our website at some point, and we'll be pouring it over for points and counterpoints to learn from. So thank you very much. Thank you to our audience, whoever you may be.
Take good care.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Cecilia.